Hello, my name is James Arvanitakis and I'm the Director of the Forrest Research Foundation. Welcome to Clever Quokkas, the only podcast dedicated to scientific research in Western Australia. Before proceeding, I want to acknowledge that this podcast is being recorded on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I pay respect to elders past and present. The Forrest Research Foundation works across the 5 Western Australian-based universities to further develop the state as a global research, knowledge and creative hub by attracting early career researchers from across the world. Today on Clever Quokkas, our guest today is Sophie Howe, the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, the only role of its kind in the world. Sophie has been named at number 5 in the BBC's Women's Power list and has been accused of leading a Welsh plot to save the world. She's one of the UK's top 100 changemakers, a global ambassador for the Wellbeing Economic Alliance, and a future governance advisor with the School of International Futures. She's also the Forrest Research Foundation's inaugural Thinker in Residence. Sophie, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. And Bore da, as we say in Wales. That's good morning in Wales.
Fantastic. It's so exciting to have you here. But it's not your first visit to Western Australia. You've been here a couple of times before, haven't you?
I have, and I've fallen in love with Perth and its people and, gosh, its landscapes. So it's an absolute pleasure to be back.
And from the reaction of when people heard you were coming back, I think Perth has fallen in love with you. So it's really great to have you back here. So let's go back a little bit and talk about a young Sophie. So can you just tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what you imagined doing when you were growing up, or what you would do as an adult?
Yeah. So I grew up in Cardiff, the capital of Wales, in quite a tough area called Ely. It was one of those places that was often in the headlines for the wrong reasons. So high levels of unemployment, high levels of crime, poor educational attainment and so on. But by virtue of the fact that both my parents worked, which was actually quite unusual for the community in Ely at the time, I actually went to school in a different part of Cardiff, a more affluent part of Cardiff where my grandparents lived, because they used to pick me up from school. And I suppose the things that when you look back and you think what's formed your views and your values over your life course, I think that was really a fundamental part, because what I came to realise early is that the aspirations and the resources and the opportunities available to the kids that I played with in the playground in school versus the kids that I played with on the street at home were vastly different. And I suppose I felt very early on that why should it be, I suppose, as I started getting more interested in politics and so on, why should it be that by virtue of like where you grow up, that determines your life chances? And then I suppose increasingly so with the role that I've done looking after the interests of future generations, why should it be that when you're born determines your life chances? And that's a really interesting one to get into too.
So you're in the playground and did you imagine, could you ever, I've never heard of the role of Future Generations Commissioner, so I imagine that a 10-year-old Sophie wouldn't have heard of that role either. So, but what were you imagine doing? Especially as you started having this recognition of almost you're picking up on issues of life chances and opportunities and aspirations. So what did you start thinking about?
Well, I wanted to be a detective based on a show that was on the telly back then. It was called Dempsey and Makepeace, and I wanted to be Makepeace. She was a really cool female detective. And actually, fast forward, gosh, I don't know how many years, 25, maybe 30 plus years. And I actually took up the role before the Future Generations Commissioner of the first Deputy Police Commissioner for South Wales. So I sort of got to do that a little bit. But of course, the role of Future Generations Commissioner didn't exist. The role of Children's Commissioner didn't exist back then. And, I think that's something for us to reflect on now as well, because 65% of kids entering primary school and kindergarten now will go on to do jobs which don't even exist yet. So it's very difficult for us to envisage. And, there is something there around how does our education system equip children, young people for this rapidly changing world, and how does it equip them with the kind of aspirations, no matter where they're from, that they can do something valuable and exciting.
Yeah, so I do want to come back to the role of being the Deputy South Wales Police and Crime Commissioner. But before we talk about that, you were elected as a local councillor for the ward of Whitechurch and I can't say
right.
this.
This is a Welsh word.
This is a Welsh thing.
Tonguin Lace, yeah.
Tonguin Lace, when you were just 21, right?
Uh-huh.
So serving, and you undertook that role for 9 years. So this made you at the time the youngest ever elected councillor. So what inspired you to do that? Was it this this sort of realization that you had as you were growing up?
Well, I suppose I grew up in a fairly political family. So my dad was quite involved in politics. He was a governor on the local school, and he was the chairman of the local Labour Party. And one of my earliest memories was walking through the streets of Cardiff, probably when I was about 4, on a right to work march. This was during the the 80s and the Thatcher government in the UK. So I suppose I was quite tuned into that, again, sort of quite tuned into the trade union movement and so on. And I suppose the background in terms of where I grew up led me to develop an interest in politics. But it was actually a female politician. So I did a degree in law and politics in Cardiff University, first in my family to go to university. And at the end of my first year, it was the 1997 election, which some people might remember as the election in the UK where Tony Blair was elected. And I volunteered to work on the campaign of a female politician who was standing for the first time in the area that I lived. And she got elected, and I helped her to set up her office. I was on my, the summer recess from university. And she became a real mentor to me, and she really encouraged me and many other women, because women had been historically really badly represented in Wales in terms of numbers. And she encouraged me to put my name forward, really to show that there were women in the system who, wanted to become politicians. And I got selected to stand for election in my final year of university. That was in the November. In the January, I found out I was pregnant, an unplanned pregnancy. That was quite a curveball.
Okay, yeah.
He's now 25. And, people told me, oh, well, that's it. That's the end.
Yeah.
That's the end of you now. You're not going to have any career. You can't possibly stand for election now if you're pregnant. But I guess I'm the sort of person that if someone tells me I can't do something, I'm definitely going to do it. And so I did my university finals in May, got elected in May, had Morgan in the September, and that was quite a kind of crazy time. Yeah.
A lot happening. I mean, there's so much there, but there's a couple of things. Like one of the things about when young people enter politics, they tend to young people often explain that they're being lethargic and disinterested in politics, and when they enter politics, they're often naive or not realistic and stuff like that. So here you are, you're a young woman in an area that is not used to electing women, or very few female representation. Quite young, 21, and a very young mother, a new mother. So, I mean, wow, and you survived that, obviously.
Yeah.
What do you recall from that time? Like, what were the experiences like, and how does that influence you going forward as well?
Well, I think the first thing was, I suppose discrimination in that political environment. So the opposition, if you like, one of their election sort of narratives was don't vote for the pregnant schoolgirl. So, had to sort of encounter and deal with that. But actually, from the public, it was a completely different reaction, because lots of people were like, gosh, this is like a breath of fresh air. We don't usually see young women and so on. And there were 4 seats in the area that I stood, and I topped the poll, and I think people were looking for something a bit different. And then when I actually got elected, I couldn't even get into City Hall initially, because the security people wouldn't believe that I was a councillor. So before I got my accreditation and everything, there were those problems. And then I think I probably spent about at least sort of 4 to 6 months trying to work out how this crazy system works. There was no training for councillors. It was like, you get elected, you meet the chief executive of the council, and then off you go, you're on your way. And the world of, standing orders and procedures and all of these things, you really have to learn that. And I suppose having done a law degree, in quite a geeky way, I got really into the standing orders, and actually used to then really use those to work to my advantage, because I used to be able to say, right, well, if I'm advancing this particular policy, I'm going to use standing order 3.21 to say that you can't do that and we must do that, or so on. And, there were some really interesting things there. But I think also I remember having a lot of debates around, raising the issues, for example, of equal pay. So we had a huge equal pay issue in the council. So, cleaners being paid far less than refuge workers, and a range of different things there. And I can remember trying to say to my party, who were in power at the time, we have got a serious equal pay problem here. And they would not believe this. And they would, she's off on one again. And then I think about 7 years later, and something like a £17 million equal pay claim that they had to settle. There we are. And raising things that I knew from my lived experience. So we had this crazy policy where if you had 2 children who needed to go to school and nursery, they were often sent, one child was sent to one school and the other child was sent to another school, which was like 3 or 4 miles down the road. And you were supposed to get them there at the same time. So making some changes there and, always having this, well, what's the problem? And I'm like, well, this is the problem. When you're actually living this life, it's physically impossible to be in 2 places at the same time. So the policy is not right for people and we need to change it. So I think it's just really important to bring that range of different perspectives. I was the only person to have young children. Some of them had had young children before, but that was way in there. They were way out of that. And so I think just bringing those different lived perspectives to politics and policy is really, really important.
And I think, also you pick on something like, you say your unplanned pregnancy and, the pregnant school and all that kind of thing. I mean, I suppose we all, things happen that aren't planned in our lives and we can all relate to that. Like, it's not as if everyone, be getting, pregnant, unwell, or getting into an accident, or parents get unwell. We don't plan for those things. So do you think there was a relatable element to that people could just go, oh, he's someone who's human and not like a trained robot, and they're just struggling like I am struggling, or trying to figure it out as I'm trying to figure it out. Yeah.
And I think, there's that authenticness, isn't there, about that. I think sometimes politicians can come across as too polished. And actually, we are seeing a backlash against that now, aren't we? Now, I would probably say that's a backlash, going perhaps in the wrong direction. But, there is something for us to reflect on there, that politicians are human. People haven't always got a huge amount of time for politicians, but the vast majority that I've ever worked with, they live, real lives. And I think the more they can bring that to the fore, the more relatable they are. And the more they can bring their personal experiences, which is why we need a more diverse range of politicians, into how they conceive public policy, the better.
So let's go back to your being the first Deputy South Wales Police and Crime Commissioner. Can you tell us a little bit about that role and how you got into it? Like, it's been like a bit of another significant jump, right?
So all of my career really has been working in public policy and public policy reform. And I suppose my passion and interest, and stems really from my childhood, is why doesn't the system work for people? Why do we develop policies, sometimes with good intention, but which don't necessarily ever get to the kind of root cause of issues? We often just put sticking plasters on things. And so I had been working in local government as an elected politician. I'd gone into national government as an advisor to the First Minister. And one of the areas that I was particularly passionate about was violence against women and girls. And so in that role, the portfolio that I advised on was local government and policing. And one of the things that I helped to take forward was the first violence against women, sexual abuse and domestic violence bill in Wales. And there, what I was trying to get at really was the fact that, domestic abuse and violence against women and girls is, I think, one of the huge undealt with epidemics in society. So, 1 in 4 women experience domestic abuse. Convictions for rape and sexual assault are minute in terms of the numbers, so like less than 1% of convictions compared to the number of assaults and so on. And so I had been working on that in government. And we see this as a police problem and a criminal justice problem, but actually the issues are way deeper than that. And we actually need a whole society response to this. So violence against women and girls is about society's perception of women. Identifying it earlier than when the police get involved is a critical part for all public services. So whether that's the healthcare system, the education system, community interventions, and so on. And of course, making sure that the police do better in terms of their role in arresting and convicting perpetrators in particular. So that was why I applied for the job of Deputy Police Commissioner, is because that was my passion, that and kind of broader issues around vulnerability reforms that were needed in the criminal justice system. And so I think going into that role, I was trying to bring a different perspective to policing, which is at one end of the system. So police generally get involved when things have gone wrong elsewhere. So how, therefore, do we start to build partnerships? So the sorts of work that I was doing in policing was bringing in healthcare professionals into the work that we were doing, training and educating midwives and general practitioners and dentists around asking questions around violence against women and girls to try to identify earlier victims that were at some point going to become a police case, if you like. So how do we get up front of that? Really listening to victims' perspectives. So for our cops, it was like, we've been to this house for the fifth, sixth time. She's still here. Why doesn't she leave him? What's the kind of brain science around that? What are all the different factors around why she doesn't leave him? And so we made a lot of reforms there, trialed a lot of things. I believe that you've got to take some risks in the way that you do things to try different approaches. And, domestic abuse is still a challenge in Wales as it is across the world. But I think we've made some progress in terms of the way that we think about intervening in a much earlier space.
I mean, I think that's this idea about when do we intervene? When do we have those conversations? What conversations aren't we having? And we have seen almost like it feels the last few months we've had almost like a regression on some of this stuff, on some of and it's as an educator who's been involved, I'm now asking myself a question: what have I missed as an educator? What could I have done? In the conversations I've had, and I think that's a really important one to sort of. We need to have, I think, and have a very brave conversation about it and say, what are we doing wrong? What how can we approach some of these issues in a much stronger way and a much more open way? And I think it's really important. Now, in your work, as part of this work on gender-based violence, you've called out for prominent men to also stand up and make statements about bad behaviour. And do you want to unpack that? Because I think that's a conversation that comes up and then disappears and comes up and disappears. But what kind of issues have you raised around that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate in my career to have, the support and I suppose, I'm going to call it, sponsorship, because I think this happens in systems and often it's, men sponsoring other men. But I've been, fortunate to have the sponsorship of some key men who've helped me develop my career and so on. And I've also been fortunate to work with some brilliant men who I would describe as feminists who've absolutely been calling out misogyny and so on. And that's so critically important because where men, as 50% of the population, don't do that, and it's left to women to constantly be calling that out. And there are a whole range of reasons why that is difficult and so on, because of the power dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. We're never going to really tackle this issue unless we have, male allies, if you like. So, I do think it's important for men to be recognising misogyny and calling it out. I think if you see some of the really quite worrying trends at the moment around toxic masculinity, around the rise, although I think, hopefully it was a relatively short-lived rise and now on the decline, but what was the rise of influencers like, you may have seen the Netflix drama Adolescence, which is forming a lot of conversation and debate in the UK. And I was just in Greece last week and, even they were talking about it there. But back to your point on those of us working in the system, how are we recognising some of these things? Well, to me, this is part of kind of what a futures orientated and a foresight enabled lens of thinking encourages, because futurists talk about looking at signals in the system. So before things become trends or issues, there are things in the system, in communities, in popular culture or emerging popular culture that are really issues that we should start paying attention to. So I think these issues, I've got 4 boys, aged from 25 down to 13. And I could tell you, just as a mum, that these issues, I can remember being in schools where I was working with the minister to develop this violence against women bill. And there, the girls were talking about, regular occurrences of sexual harassment, of lifting skirts and of, really sort of problematic language and so on happening. Now, those are signals in the system, okay, which now then start flowing into sort of trends, which it then takes a Netflix drama for everyone to go, oh my God, this is a problem. Whereas actually, if we had a more foresight-enabled mindset, all of us, particularly public policymakers who were looking for those signals in the system, we would be getting up front of these issues before they became major problems.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I suppose on that front, one of the things that we've been having a lot of conversations with friends of mine lately is where are the examples of positive masculinity, and I think that's something that we kind of need to recapture. What does that look like? And I think relating positive masculinity to all the things that sometimes we maybe historically we've passed, like sport and contact sports and things like that, which is a way, I suppose, I always think about humans as mammals, and we always want to play. All mammals play. That's how they learn, and so encouraging more of that and trying to figure out how we can take those examples forward. But do you think there are enough examples of positive masculinity around, and do you think we can do more?
I mean, I think that they're around. If I think about just in my family and my community, there are hundreds, thousands of people that I can think about who convey that. But are they influencers? Like, who are those people who I think are, there's a need for us to really be promoting that through the channels that children, young people in particular, are watching and listening to. And I think there's also a need in Wales. One of the things that we did from this Violence Against Women Act is to embed mandatory education on healthy relationships in schools. Not that it's just taught as a kind of one-off, this is a public and personal and social education class, but as a kind of mainstreamed approach throughout schools. So we need to be having these conversations regularly in families, in communities, in schools, online, digital media, and so on. And I think that is joining the dots between all of those things are really important, but also recognising where there are these dark influences that are starting to take hold and really starting to crack down and regulate some of that as well.
Yeah, and I think when we get in those spaces, I wonder if there's a better way to engage with that space before it becomes engage in that space of negative or toxic masculinity, engage in that space in a conversation as an educator or an academic. Often when you get a dark space, we go, oh, let's avoid that. And by avoiding it, my argument is always if you don't have the conversation in the classroom, someone's going to have it in the pub, in a very different environment, or in a cafe or something like that, and you're not there to kind of moderate's not even the right word, but just to be part of that conversation and go, hey, before you talk, this is something else you need to think about, and I think it's important that we brave enough to bring those conversations and have them. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. And sometimes I think society can get a bit linear and procedural on things, shut that down immediately. And, there are good reasons for that. I can understand that perspective. But in the long term, I don't think that necessarily helps. And I think people need help and guidance to navigate this, particularly our teachers and people working with young people. And I'm viewing from both a professional lens and a parent lens how those things are happening in our schools. And I think I've seen some brilliant practice and also some very nervous kind of like, we don't really know how to handle this, so let's shut it down practice as well. But this requires, I think, a whole society approach to this and a recognition that this has been a problem for a long time. It's an increasing problem, and it's something that we can't just ignore.
You talked about signals and your visit here, going back to your visit here in Australia now. 10 years ago, so 2015, the Welsh Government passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations. It was a world first. Can you give us a little bit of background about that legislation and how it came about and the role of signals? I just find this so fascinating. Yeah.
So Wales has had a fairly long history with sustainable development. So and we're a relatively new democratic institution in Wales in terms of the Welsh Parliament. So the Welsh Parliament was, or the Assembly as it was called then, was first established in 1999. And in the law, the Government of Wales Act that established the Parliament and government, it said that sustainable development should be a central organising principle of the government. So that's all very nice and, sensible and a lofty ambition. Anyone who's worked in and around sort of government and politics will know that there are these clauses all over the place. There are lots of constitutional clauses on protecting the rights of future generations. But when they're that vague, it means that nothing ever happens. So in reality, this meant that the Environment Minister in the Parliament was asked to bring a report to the Parliament once a year on stuff that had been happening in government on sustainable development. And when I worked in government, I was on the end of phone calls going, oh God, our minister's got a report like in 2 weeks. Can you tell us stuff that your department's done on sustainable development? So we absolutely could not say it was a central organising principle and framing the way that we did everything. So there was a kind of frustration, if you like, particularly from the Environment Minister, a woman called Jane Davidson, who'd been a long-standing minister in the government, around, why was it her responsibility to deliver this when she couldn't get buy-in from how the Transport Minister was acting in a sustainable way, how the Economy Minister was doing the same. And she actually worked with civil society outside of government to say, well, actually, you guys should be critiquing us on how we're doing this, how we're meeting this clause. And she was also really forward-looking in terms of like scanning across the world, where's the best practice on sustainable development, who's doing the most interesting stuff, and developed a bright team of government officials who are working with her on that. And there's some lessons there that we're seeing in terms of, and perhaps we'll get onto this in a bit, but how we're seeing this type of thinking advance in other countries. There are 3 critical elements to really embedding long-term thinking and sustainable actions in a system. So you have to have pressure from the outside, civil society, NGOs, academia, the media. You have to have political champions in the system. And then you have to have capacity and capability in your machinery of government, so with your civil servants and so on. So she had, I suppose, I don't think she was framing it in that way, but inadvertently was building across those 3 parts of what we describe as the kind of intergenerational fairness prism. And also what you see in many countries, and this happened in Wales, is that there's often a political moment that kind of is the moment where you can take something from a kind of vague concept that is building a bit of momentum to, right, now's the moment that we can do it. And in Wales, in 2010, the political moment was that the UK elected for the first time in 13-odd years, Liberal Democrat and Conservative coalition to form a government. And one of the first things that they did was to abolish this non-statutory Sustainable Development Commission that had existed in England. And if there's one thing to know about Wales, it's that basically we like to do whatever it is that's the opposite of England. So that was our political moment. And that enabled this minister to say to her cabinet colleagues who'd previously not been that interested, look what those horrible people down the other end of the M4 motorway have done. Not only should we not abolish our non-statutory commission in Wales, but we should put it on a statutory footing to show this difference and this distinction between the way that we do policy in Wales. So she managed to get that election commitment. She then actually retired from government at the next election, and the new government were left with this thing that had been her baby, which they'd committed to, which they thought, oh God, what is this going to be now? How do we frame this? And there comes the importance of having already built this movement outside the system and built this movement inside the system, where they came up with this genius idea of, well, if we don't know exactly what this should be, because the one-liner in the election, the commitment had just said, we will legislate for sustainable development. What is that? Well, if we don't know what it is, we should ask the people of Wales. And they then held this national conversation with the citizens of Wales, where they posed the question, what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren and future generations to come? And that's really powerful because governments don't have those conversations with citizens. We might ask them very narrow conversation, should we close this hospital and replace it with that? Or what do you think about this particular policy or so on? And when you give people an opportunity to have those sort of broader and more future-focused discussions, you get into a much deeper sense of what matters, values, aspirations. And that was done in a range of ways, from your town hall meetings, your online platforms. We had 1,000 future champions across Wales who were convening conversations in their local community or their particular sector. So the young farmers were convening conversations amongst their organisations. School children were writing letters to their future self around their aspirations. All of that came back up into the centre, was analysed. What the people of Wales said were important to them in terms of what they wanted to leave behind were framed into 7 long-term wellbeing goals for Wales. So basically a vision of the Wales that we want to leave to our grandchildren and future generations.
Amazing. I mean, it's really interesting because when framed that way as well, it's more of a uniting conversation, because we can say, okay, this is what we want. We all want that. How we get there, we can then start talking about,
Exactly.
right? There's different mechanisms. And maybe that's where the arguments begin to happen. But I would say, what do you want to leave for your future? It's not like someone saying, I want to leave a future full of plastic pollution. I don't think kids need trees or I need this. Is that how it felt at the time? It was a uniting conversation?
Absolutely, which is fascinating because when I have conversations in different parts of the world now, different governments who are thinking about doing this, polarization is such a big issue. People are kind of like, oh God, but how do you get to this consensus? But you're absolutely right. It's actually not that difficult to reach a consensus that we kind of want clean air to breathe.
Yeah.
And, we want to be healthy. In Wales, some of the things that came up is that sense of community. There's always been a very strong sense of community in Wales, and we wanted to maintain that. The importance of our language, our culture, and our heritage, we want to pass that on to the next generation. We don't want to lose that. So it actually wasn't that difficult. And again, we're not really seeing on the same scale, perhaps national conversations, but where we do see these pockets of conversations happen with citizens in different parts of the world, they're actually all coming up with very similar things. And what that does when you're able to take that citizen mandate, if you like, and form that into a long-term vision, sets a long-term vision for a country, a North Star by which we're saying, this is where we're aiming to go. So we need to test everything that we're doing in, is it helping or hindering us getting towards that long-term vision? And I always say you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a long-term vision, but it's completely revolutionary because generally you only get it within electoral cycles. And here that's even more problematic because you've got a 3-year term. What can you possibly achieve in a 3-year term? And that's why we don't often tackle these big issues like climate change, like intergenerational wealth inequality, like how do we invest in preventing illness rather than just treating it? So having that vision, I think, is really important. And then I suppose the final thing that I'd say about the vision is giving people the ability to set something positive for the future, because often when we think about the future, it's all about risk. What are we trying to avoid? We're trying to avoid the catastrophe of climate change, or we're trying to avoid arc results from technology and AI, or we're trying to avoid this. Actually, let's turn that on its head and say, what are we trying to aim for? And let's set our governments and all of our institutions on a mission to create that positive.
So the Act is passed in 2015, and then in 2016 you get elected as the first Future Generations Commissioner, which is amazing. So can we talk a little bit about that? What did this role involve, and how did maybe we can unpack a little bit about what it felt like being the first, the pressure of being obviously you would have experienced that as being an elected pregnant schoolgirl. So first the role involved, and then the pressure that you felt about making it feel, obviously it was really relying on you to be successful, because if it wasn't successful, then the next change of government comes along and says, well, why do we need this?
Yeah. So appointed as the first Future Generations Commissioner, let me just say a little bit about what that role entails. So as set out in law, the Commissioner has powers to advise and support all of our public institutions in Wales. So just to give a bit of a kind of a précis of what the legislation means. So it applies to all of our public institutions in Wales. So from the Welsh Government down to local government, even at a community level, and everything in between. So our Public Health Agency, our Environment Agency, and so on. And they all have duties to set objectives which maximise their contribution to achieving these 7 long-term wellbeing goals. So these are the goals set by citizens. And there's a few game changers in that. 1, it's the long-term vision they've got to work towards. 2, they all have duties to maximise their contribution to all of the goals. Now, that basically means you have to sweep away your silos, because if you're the Environment Agency, it's just, and your core business might be protecting the environment, you have to show how you're doing that whilst also considering reaching the goal of a prosperous Wales, and also reaching the goal of a more equal Wales, and also reaching the goal of a healthier Wales, for example. So the role of the Commissioner really was to advise and support public institutions on how they do that. The other part of the Commissioner's duties were to monitor and assess the progress that was being made and report on that. And then the tougher end of the Commissioner's powers, Section 20 review powers. So I could intervene in decisions that had been taken or were about to be taken. I could review particular organisations as to how well they were progressing and so on. Now, I couldn't force anyone to do anything or stop anyone from doing anything because, I wasn't democratically elected. It's a public appointment. So there are, some intersections with the democratic accountability there. But it was basically the power to name and shame. So if people weren't getting it right, I could name and shame them. And I, did that on some occasions. But starting with, being the first, had to set up a whole new public office, if you like, and set the tone of how we go about doing this. So having worked in public policy and government at all different levels over the course of my career, I had seen so many new and well-intentioned policies or pieces of legislation which required us to do things like you must write a plan to do blah, blah, blah. There must be a such and such a strategy. You must report on that strategy every year or every 5 years or whatever it might be. Because that's the nature of legislation. You kind of have to make it specific. And all of those things were in the Future Generations Act. But by God, if we just made it a kind of reporting thing, it was going to fall flat. This was really, as I describe it, the biggest, if it was going to work, it was going to be the biggest cultural change programme that the Welsh public sector had ever seen. This is about fundamentally changing the ways that we work. This is about shifting mindsets. This is about how are we thinking in everything that we do about making the connections beyond just our policy silo to the rest of them, and how are we thinking about how do we apply foresight and how are we using the futures lens in doing this. So I was really determined not just to make it a kind of tick box exercise. And, it was fascinating to see and not unexpected to see that in the first phase of plans that were coming out from each of our public bodies to meet their statutory duties, they were basically putting the same old crap in their plans and using well-being of future generations words to describe it. And I was sort of saying to them, well, that's all very well and good, but, how are you joining the dots between, because over here you've said that in the health goal, you want to give every child the best start in life. Over here, connected communities, you're building more roads, which are going to add to pollution and which are not going to facilitate modal shift and healthier ranges of travel. So explain to me how you've applied the legislation in joining up that long-term vision. Right, okay, we have a problem there. So it took a while to get people out of this kind of just go through the motions, tick the box, miss the point, and so on, into how do we think about this in a different way. And I suppose one of the approaches that I took, so the people I had in my office, the team, their job description was change maker. So that was their role, drive the change, however that might be. And sometimes, working to say, well, in this area, driving the change means really robust data. In this area, it might mean the power to tell stories in a different way. In this way, it's about holding the hand of these public officials who are trying to do different ways of doing things and really helping them to navigate a system. In this area, it might be we need to use the commissioners stronger powers and really call out and name and shame. So it was finely balanced trying to work out where the best way or what were the best approaches to use. And I think some of the most significant things that we did was to identify these people in the system that I call the frustrated champions. So throughout the system, I guess I'm primarily talking about the kind of public sector system, the government at all levels and our government agencies and so on. But these frustrated champions are everywhere. They're in academia, they're in the corporate world, they're in, civil society and NGOs. These are people who can see or have seen that for a long time, there's a much better way of doing things, but the system frustrates them from doing those things. So these might be your medics who are seeing one generation of a family coming into the healthcare system with the same preventable conditions, and all we do is issue a prescription or a treatment rather than getting into what is the lifestyle of this person, what's the broader holistic things that are happening in their lives, and how are those things affecting their health. They might be the transport engineer who built a road 15 years ago because of congestion, and that road is now full as well, and we've still got no options to get people onto public transport because we haven't invested in that. It might be the social workers who are seeing one generation of a family coming into the care system because we haven't intervened earlier in those families. So those frustrated champions, they're everywhere. And my main mission early on was to identify who they were and to really help them to use the legislation to challenge the system and to challenge the people that I call the abominable no men. Okay, so these are the people, sometimes they're lawyers, sometimes they're finance directors, sometimes they're people who just want to operate in their silo to say, unless you're going to be able to show me that there's a return on this investment this year, then I'm not interested. Or I'm protecting my budget over here. There's no way I'm giving my budget over there. To be able to take a piece of law to them and wave that law at them and say, actually, you now have a statutory duty to act in a different way. And the thing that I'm proposing to do is absolutely in line with achieving this. And if we don't start to do this, the commissioner's going to be on your case as well. So anything from, I can remember one of these early frustrated champions, a woman called Sally Atwood, who she was the procurement and estates person in Public Health Wales. And they were moving offices. They had 7 different offices. They were combining them all into one. And there was a procurement process that they went through, which was all about lowest cost and so on and so on. She actually said, hang on, we now have new duties under the Future Generations Act in terms of how we spend our money. We're also Public Health Wales. Our main objective is around the health of the nation. So I'm not going to just procure this new building at lowest cost. I need to be able to show how this building is going to be net zero, because environment or climate change is one of the biggest future contributors to poor health. I also need to be showing what are the opportunities for us to be procuring our furniture, bringing all of our existing furniture together and reusing it. I also need to be able to show how we're helping lower incomes, families who are more likely to be in poor health. So the carpets that they procured from a social enterprise who their profits went into providing carpets for lower income families. And she had a huge battle with the procurement people around this. She won that battle. She used the Future Generations Act. That became a case study. We started highlighting that case study, challenging other parts of the system to say, if you're not doing something similar, you're not meeting your obligations under the Future Generations Act. And that just started to spin out. And Sally is one of thousands of champions that we identified doing those sorts of things in different parts of the system and influencing others.
Amazing, yeah. Well, what a different way to do things rather than just looking at that short-term return on investment. So let's keep on this theme of the Future Generations Act. So one of the things you're here, as I mentioned, as a thinker in residence for the Forrest Research Foundation. And one of the conversations we want to have is about, should Western Australia have a Future Generations Act? So can we talk a bit about what it would look like and what kind of outcomes you think people would expect?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting looking at some of the election platforms or manifestos, as we would call them, I guess, that the parties have stood on in the most recent election. And, you know, some of the aspirations in there and things that they want to deliver are, you know, very focused on creating a resilient future. So looking at transformations in terms of, you know, jobs and industry, giving every child the best start in life. Interesting to see in some of the manifestos or the election platforms that there's some interesting things around supporting grandparents, for example. And sometimes when you're asked around, you know, well, how do we get, you know, older generations, you know, caring about, you know, future generations or even those yet to be born? I think grandparents, they do care about their grandchildren. They do want to give them a better life. I think looking at some of the commitments that are in those election commitments, there are some fundamentals there which, unless we put these in place, it's going to be very difficult for those things to be achieved. If we're only looking at those issues in the short term without taking a long-term view, both in terms of how do we get up front of issues, how do we deal with the root causes of problems, and how do we anticipate things which might be coming down the track at us, we're never going to solve those issues. So if we want to give every child the best start in life, for example, we need to be investing in early intervention now in families and in children where there might be particular issues in those families where that child is not going to get the best start in life. We talk about the first 1,000 days, so from pregnancy to age 2 being the most critical time in a child's life, and investing in family support, in good nutrition, in creating a healthy environment in those first 1,000 days in particular is critically important. But when we do that, you're not going to see the benefits of that until, you know, much later on. So we've got to break this link between us wanting to see results within a kind of year, 2-year or 3-year electoral cycle. And we've got to be committed. If we're committed to giving every child the best start in life, that's a long-term set of interventions. The other critical thing is around joining the dots between different policy areas. So let's stick with that theme, giving every child the best start in life. What's the role of the economy department in giving every child the best start in life? What's the connection between what we also want to do in terms of diversification of jobs and industry? Well, if we're thinking about diversification and if we're thinking about the way in which we roll out policies in that area, actually, some of the ways of giving children the best start in life is to making sure that we're developing clean, green industry, to make sure that we're cleaning up our environment. Alongside that, thinking about how do we start to create new jobs in some of those cleaner and greener industries, and how do we get right up front in terms of a skills pipeline to target those families who are furthest from the labour market, those families who've got kids living in poverty, target those to develop the skills to enable them to get these really good jobs that are going to be emerging. That's how we start thinking about joining the dots. So when we say that we're giving every child the best start in life, that is a role for the economy department. That's a role for the environment department. That's a role in terms of how health is thinking about investing in community and preventative interventions, not just treating people when they're ill.
Public parks, beaches,
absolutely,
transport, and it just goes on and on and on. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah. Now, look, your role, actually, because you were talking specifically around the Western Australian state election, which was a couple of weeks ago, but your visit also involved. We're in the middle of campaigning for a federal election. So, for the first time in Australian history, young voters will outnumber baby boomers. So, what might this generational shift mean for long-term policy making, and what policy areas should government prioritise in this sort of changing demographic?
Yeah, well, I mean, younger generations do have a different perspective on life to older generations. And if you're a human resources professional, or if you're someone trying to attract the best possible skills, you will have been talking, or will be, be on your radar, the fact that younger generations they have a much deeper connection to the types of values that an organisation has. They want to have a life-work balance, not necessarily a work
balance. Yeah,
exactly. They have a different sort of slant on things. They are digital natives, so they're consuming, media in different ways and so on. So I think it's really kind of fundamental for us to be thinking about the different types of approaches, values, interests and priorities that our younger generations have. I also think that our younger generations are acutely aware that their life chances are actually the sort of, current younger generations are probably the first generations whose lives are going to be worse off than their parents. So in terms of their ability to afford to buy a home, in terms of the impacts of climate change, in terms of this increasing wealth inequality gap. So there's certainly something there, I think, for politicians to be thinking about in terms of how they address their needs. And of course, I can see that in the current priorities that have been announced, things like a focus on first-time housing provision. Now, that's a good thing, but the way in which those policies are carried out, I mean, you could build hundreds of thousands of new homes, potentially, with capital investment and so on. You've got to be careful about how you think about that in terms of increasing house prices, but also the way in which you do that. So can we join the dots between building thousands of new homes and creating good quality jobs which target those who are furthest from the labour market? Can we be thinking about addressing other priorities around equity? So building those homes, who is going to be building those homes? Are we going to be increasing the number of women in the construction industry and the women in those sort of broader sectors? What sort of homes are they going to be? Are they going to be net zero homes, or are they going to be homes that are not addressing the climate emergency and we're going to be adding to that for future generations? Are they going to be homes which also take into account demographic change? So a larger number of people living alone, a larger number of ageing population. So are they going to be fit for the future? So what I would like to see, I suppose, and it's not just what I would like to see, it's just sensible policy making, is how do we start to frame those things, the big priorities, in a way which don't just deliver that priority in a linear way, but which actually add multiple benefits, because the way in which they're carried out have looked to the future and have joined the dots between different policy priorities.
Amazing. I heard something the other day, and you probably know this, and it was a society will thrive when people plant trees today that they will never get to enjoy the shade of, because they'll blossom in decades ahead. And I think that's the kind of society you're describing.
Yeah, and some people also call that cathedral thinking. I don't know, Gaudi's cathedral, for example. People built those, and as you said, never expecting to see the benefits of them. But it was a long-term investment in, I suppose, the culture and heritage and passing something on to future generations. And they're now the things we're so grateful that we've got and we would never do away with. So what is our role as the 8 billion of us that are on planet Earth at the moment? If we look 50,000 years to the future, okay, based on current population trends, there are about 6.75 trillion people yet to be born. And when we think about some of the really critical issues that we're responsible for on planet Earth, and at the moment, what we do, the 8 billion of us, and in reality a much tiny number of that, those who hold the power, will really determine the lives that those 6.75 trillion people live or don't live. So we've got to get better at thinking to the future, and we've got to be much better ancestors than we currently are.
Fantastic. Sophie, thank you so much for your time. This has just been such an amazing conversation. I really, really appreciated you chatting to you and sharing all those insights.
Thanks for having me.
So that was Sophie Howe, the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, who's now in Perth with the Forrest Research Foundation as our inaugural thinker in residence. And there's a number of public events with Sophie where you get a chance to hear these insights, and we'll be advertising those on our website. Thank you for joining us on Clever Quokkas. My name is James Arvanitakis, and if you have any questions for us, please do not hesitate to reach out to us via LinkedIn or on X @Forrest Foundation. Thank you.